Hello, everyone. Welcome. It looks like most of you have entered the webinar, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for being here. My name is Carmi-Anna Matson. I am the current president of the Minnesota Economic Association and an assistant vice president at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. This morning, I would like to thank the institutional members of the MEA who make it possible for us to host this conference annually. They subsidize our speaker honorarium as well as cash prizes for our undergraduate student paper contest winners. And those student paper contest winners will be honored at the completion of our program today. So thank you to these institutions who made an additional contribution to the MEA in order to do that. Augsburg College, Carleton College, College of St. Benedict, St. John's University, the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, Gustavus Adolphus College, Hamline University, Macalester College, Metropolitan State University, St. Catherine University, St. Cloud State University, St. Olaf College, University of Minnesota Duluth, University of Minnesota Twin Cities Department of Applied Economics, University of Minnesota Twin Cities Department of Economics, University of St. Thomas, and Winona State University. I'd also like to thank the 2020 board members of the MEA, whose names are listed here. They help us to organize this conference each year, and they also judge our student paper contest entries. The members of our board, myself, our president-elect Louis Johnston from the College of St. Benedict, St. John's University, our secretary Liang Ding from Macalester College, our treasurer Wanyang Kim from Augsburg, our past president Stacy Bosley from Hamline, Maha Esgari from Winona State, Atreyu Ghosh Roy from Mankato, Jonathan Lafke from Carleton, Jeremy Lease from the Department of Economics at the U of M, Lynn McDonald from St. Cloud State, Tadi Okadiji from Applied Economics at the U of M, Vadi Rao from Metro State, Vidasa Tedesi from Duluth, and Hong Wu from St. Thomas. Special thank you to incoming President Louis Johnston from St. Ben St. John's, who will be moderating our Q&A today with our speaker. And a special thank you to Stacy Bosley, our outgoing president, for all of her support over the past 6 years, as well as the support of Hamline University, who she represents. We are pleased today to welcome our Heller Distinguished Lecturer, Dr. Lisa D. Cook, Professor of Economics and International Relations at Michigan State University. Dr. Cook has a BA in philosophy from Spelman College. As a Marshall Scholar, she received a second BA from Oxford University in philosophy, politics, and economics. She has a PhD in economics from the University of California at Berkeley. Among her current research interests are economic growth and development, financial institutions and markets, innovation, and economic history. As a senior economist at the President's Council of Economic Advisors during the 2011-2012 academic year, Dr. Cook worked on the Eurozone, financial instruments, innovation, and entrepreneurship. She is currently director of the American Economic Association Summer Training Program. Dr. Cook will be taking questions at the end of her presentation. If you have a question you'd like to ask, please locate the Zoom chat box at the bottom of your screen. You can type your question in the chat box, and then Louis Johnston will select questions from the chat, and he will pose them to Lisa verbally at the conclusion of her presentation. Thanks for being with us today, Dr. Cook. I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Carmi, and thank you so much for the invitation. This is so exciting, and thank you all for preserving this. This could have been canceled, and what you said was that this is too important to undergraduates, and I agree with you. This kind of engagement is something that I relish and that I promote on a daily basis, so I really appreciate your inviting me and going ahead with this part of the conference. So I'll go ahead and share my screen so we can get started here. (1870) eminently
Lisa, I'm sorry, could I interrupt you for just a moment? It seems we have lost audio of you temporarily. No, you seem to have suddenly dropped from the audio. I can hear your keyboard clicking, Lisa, but I can't actually hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now I can hear you. Yes.
Yes, okay. So now I am reestablishing video. Let's see how we can do that. I think I have to stop share for a second. Here we go. No, no, don't leave, don't leave, don't leave, don't leave.
Well, and if you'd like, you could continue the presentation without the video. Oh, there we go. Video and audio. Excellent audio as well. Good.
Okay, so let's go ahead and get started again.
Great.
Okay, so sorry about that. So there is a growing literature on the effects of terrorism on economic growth and other outcomes. We remember, many of us remember the paper by Abadi and Gardiazabal that looks at the effects of ETA on the economy of the Basque region and Spain. This region is often threatening to leave the entire Spain, and there's an active movement now. What they find is that terrorist acts affect stock prices and the real economy. Fryer and Levitt 2012 examined the KKK's organization and effect on election outcomes. They found that it had no effect, but found that the KKK was mainly a social club good at selling robes. I have a more general concern with respect to this literature, this line of research. There was certainly pre and post election violence in 2016 in the US. There was a warning in 2016, and there has been an increase until now of hate-related violence. This is published by the Southern Poverty Law Center. Every year has been a record-breaking year with respect to hate-related crimes in the US since they've been keeping tabs on this, keeping records of it. In 2016, I wrote an op-ed based on my research about what might happen after the election, and I was attempting to get people organized and leaders organized and focused so that they could diminish this kind of activity that could affect people broadly. And I was called alarmist at the time. Many of the things I predicted would happen actually did happen, and it was published when that did happen. But I think there's a role to play of my research and others' research to show how violence can affect economic activity as well as society. So we also have, as another motive to study this, is the killing of George Floyd and other police-involved killings. Again, when we see this much beyond the people who were in, say, the Black Lives Matter movement, this was much more widely shared than had been the case with many of the police-involved shootings and killings before. So this has had an effect on our understanding of violence, especially racialized violence. We also have a broader movement, longer term movement to understand poor property rights environments. And the question there is, what are the implications for long run economic growth and living standards as a result of that violence? And certainly we've seen other countries, this has largely been focused on other countries, ones that are economically and politically important to the United States. But certainly we saw a pivot of concern when the Syrian war started breaking out. People started joining ISIS and came back to the US and Europe and Canada. And we had much more of a conversation about homegrown domestic hate-related terrorism, including due to Russian meddling on social media, the suppressed 2009 Department of Homeland Security report on domestic terrorism, and then recent attempts to kidnap and or assassinate the governors of Michigan and Virginia. So this is a broader concern to everyone, not just to economists. So using a new and unique data set on patents that I constructed, I find that for Blacks and for whites, hate-related violence has a negative and persistent effect on economic activity. I found 726 patents versus 1,100 patents that I should have found, and that would have been the size of a medium-sized European country at the time. So this would have been significant. This violence depresses economic activity in the most important areas, including electrical and mechanical innovation. I also find that once hate-related violence ceases, economic activity resumes. This is consistent with previous studies, and it's also consistent with other forms of economic activity, as I'll show you. For the remainder of the talk, I wanted to talk to you about hate-related violence in history during this period, inventive activity during this period, data which was a Herculean task, the findings from estimation, the conclusion from that research, and the ongoing and future research that I am engaged in and with co-authors. So I used 3 proxies for violence. What I used for identification was Jim Crow laws or segregation laws, which could be seen as latent violence or a substitute for violence, certainly upholding violence, major race riots, and lynchings per capita. And I'll just go through each. Race-related violence in the United States increased significantly between 1870 and 1940. Segregation laws peaked in 1908, 1928, and 1933. Race riots peaked in 1919. Lynchings peaked in 1892 and 1893. Let's start with segregation laws. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 was passed, and this was hallmark, the crowning achievement, one of the crowning achievements of Reconstruction. Then Southern states started chipping away at the Civil Rights Act of 1875 and testing it at every juncture. Tennessee was the first state that started to do this by allowing separate but equal accommodations on public transportation. That was in 1881. This chipping away led to the repeal of provisions of the Civil Rights Act. And finally, this culminated, the proliferation of segregation laws in the South culminated in Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court ruling that allowed separate but equal policies. After that, there was a proliferation of segregation laws outside the South. And after that, President Wilson imposed segregation of the civil service, which had a really detrimental effect on Blacks who were in civil service at the time. I'll say more about that in just a moment. What I include in this measure is state laws related to education and public transportation and accommodations. These are the largest categories. Voting, housing, and property, labor. And then there's the miscellaneous category that included laws related to intermarriage, the military, and race classification. So just so you understand, there were lots of laws that preceded these state laws that had to do with intermarriage and race classification. Louisiana didn't repeal these until the 1980s or so to say that someone who is 3/22 Black is considered Black. So there were longstanding laws related to race classification and intermarriage. All racial restrictions are included that involve ethnic minorities. So it's not just African Americans. I wanted to capture the sense, the overall climate, and not just those related to African Americans. So this included laws that related to the Chinese, so like the Chinese exclusion law, the Japanese, Native Americans. They were mainly against African Americans. These laws were also fairly convoluted, and I'll take an example from Georgia during this period. It shall be unlawful for any amateur white baseball team to play baseball on any vacant lot or baseball diamond within 2 blocks of a playground devoted to the Negro race, and it should be unlawful for any amateur colored baseball team to play baseball in any vacant lot or baseball diamond within 2 blocks of any playground devoted to the white race. Okay, so this is convoluted in a couple of ways. One glaring way is that we don't know who's Negro and we don't know who's colored. So these laws were often very hard to enforce. They were sometimes this specific and very hard to enforce, but could cause a lot of confusion and separation. Between 1870, there's a lot of, in 1940, there was a lot of heterogeneity with respect to the kinds of laws that were passed and how many were passed. And I'm just giving you a sample of how many were passed in each state. In Iowa, Michigan, Minnesota, Vermont, and Wisconsin, there were 0. But I want to make sure we understand what 0 means here. 0 doesn't mean that no Jim Crow laws were passed. They may have preceded the period 1870, and in fact, a number of states, including Minnesota, saw the enslaved people being emancipated and thought it might be a good idea to pass some laws preemptively before they start moving outside the South. This doesn't mean that formerly enslaved people were welcomed to the North. So many state legislatures were trying to be preemptive. There were some that had a small number of laws passed, like Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, Indiana, and Kansas, and Arkansas, Washington, D.C., and Nevada. And then those who had relatively more, like Mississippi and Maryland, North Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, and 25 were passed in Kentucky during this period. This is a border state. What does this exclude? It excludes something really important, city ordinances that restrict or limit residential segregation. They establish residential segregation. They limit racial integration. This includes sundown laws excludes sundown laws, for example. So these are going to be really important. It also excludes federal legislation, except in the case of Washington, D.C. The 1913 Wilson Civil Service ban had an immediate effect on Washington, and a new paper by Anija and Zhu suggests that there is a very negative labor market outcome for African Americans with this ban. I exclude laws that are overturned within 3 years of passage. To me, these would constitute a mistake. So those aren't included. And then these excluded laws will bias the coefficient on Jim Crow laws towards 0. So I'm being very conservative here. What about race riots and race-related civil disturbances? This is mob violence in which groups are targeted. Sometimes they are politically motivated, but not always. They typically involved the destruction of property and deaths. Major riots were largely confined to the South before 1900. but they moved largely outside the South after 1900. And the first major one outside the South was in New York in 1900. Non-Southern states accounted for 60% of major riots from 1900. And here I'm only including major riots. This doesn't include all state level riots, but major ones. And this isn't determined by me, but it's determined primarily by using the proceedings of the Select Committee on Assassinations of the U.S. House of Representatives. This was put in place after the assassinations of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King. So historians are the ones who have determined these riots. And I wanted to give you an example of a riot, a canonical example of a riot. And this one was in 1906 in Atlanta. So there was this race-baiting gubernatorial race, and lynch journalism, what was called lynch journalism at the time, was happening between the Atlanta Journal, the two major papers, the Atlanta Journal and the Atlanta Constitution. So just so you understand what lynch journalism is, it's like the Facebook of that period. These stories were written, they fomented anger, they were not scrutinized, but they spread rumors. And many papers after this period, and in the current period since 1990 or so, apologized for their fomenting racial violence in this way by not scrutinizing the journalism they engaged in. Alleged immoral behavior was a part of it. There was public drunkenness, and then there came an armed mob and the riot ensued. The state militia was called in. So one of the points that was raised early when I wrote this paper was, well, you know, inventors are typically left out of this kind of violence. They're not affected by this kind of violence. Researchers, people in academia would not be affected by it. No, they would not have been excluded from this kind of violence. W.B. Du Bois, who was at Atlanta University at the time, an eminent scholar doing his work on rural activity in Alabama around Tuskegee. He's there minding his own business, doing his research. He had to put down everything, race home to Atlanta, get his family, get a shotgun, and leave, flee with his family. So we were not immune, and inventors were not immune to this kind of behavior, this kind of violent behavior. This received national and international coverage, so there wasn't just a local effect from these riots. So these are newspaper articles from the New York Times at the time. This is another example. This is from the Petit Parisien, so it got international coverage in Paris and France. And to show that it also wasn't just a local effect from these major race riots, this is a photograph from the NAACP silent march down Fifth Avenue in New York to protest the major riot in East St. Louis in 1917. So everyone, African Americans, no matter where they were, had this sense of terror and dread as a result of these acts of violence, particularly these race riots. The most researched one is Tulsa in 1921. It is estimated that there were between 100 and 300 deaths. Over 1,200 homes and businesses were destroyed. There were roughly 3,000 people made homeless. As in Atlanta, many firms and families fled. This was nationally reported. The NAACP calls President Harding to end the violence. And this is the first time that the NAACP went so far as to call the president directly to try to end the violence there. So you probably heard about Tulsa. Certainly got a lot of media attention this past summer. And an update from October 2018 and more recently, the Tulsa mayor reopened an investigation due to the reports of mass graves, the finding of mass graves. So this estimate between 100 and 300 deaths may actually rise. And this is just a photograph from the Black Wall Street on fire in Tulsa in 1921. Let's move to lynchings or extrajudicial killings. This is an extreme form of violence. This connotes the absence of rule of law. Here, individuals or an individual might be targeted. These are mainly Black victims, and they're mainly in the South during this period. So this graph just shows lynchings per million of Blacks and whites, and the magenta line is Blacks, and the right axis to read from for that line will be the right-hand axis, and for whites, it is blue, and the appropriate axis is the left-hand axis for white lynching victims per million. So what you can see is that they're moving in the same direction, largely in the same direction, and this is falling over time. You see the peak in the 1890s for both. With respect to causal factors, Tolnay and Beck conjecture that this is inversely related to the price of cotton. Darity and Price have a paper that looks at racial stigma associated with being a former slave as a causal factor related to lynching. It turns out from their study that cotton prices are more important, but both of these studies, and this is consistent for this literature more generally, they find that the relation between cotton prices and lynchings is inconclusive after 1905. So I have 35 more years of lynchings to explain in this data set. So this does not hold after 1905. So there should be another explanation. In general, there's no systematic evidence on the causes of lynchings. And what we do know is that these factors are uncorrelated with patenting activity. What's not included in lynchings? Not included are racial cleansings with no violence. This is Alive in the Bitter Waters, Elliot Jaspin, 2007, or Sundown Towns. Again, these racial cleansings that announced that all African-American families had to leave within 48 hours or so, or they would be killed. So sometimes these racial cleansings happened with no violence. What also is not included here is the theft of intellectual property in this study. This is largely anecdotal, so there are certainly letters in the Library of Congress that speak to the theft of intellectual property of individuals, but there is little systematic evidence of this. So this isn't included in the study. I'd like to say a bit about patenting activity that is happening in this period. Lewis Latimer was busy working on carbon filaments for lamps. He was working on Edison's patenting, the lubricator cup that was invented by Elijah the Real McCoy, and that's where the term comes from. This lubricator cup had to be so precise that he had to be the one. He was an engineer. He had a first college degree in engineering from Scotland, and he worked in Ypsilanti, Michigan. This lubricator cup diminished fires in engines and railway engines by 60%, more than 60% during that period. So this was a big innovation. Well-ray telegraphy and the third rail. This was invented by Granville T. Woods, who was called the Black Edison. He was sued by Edison twice and won, which was unheard of during that period. The pressing comb and other inventions related to cosmetology by Madam C.J. Walker, the first Black millionaire. Paints and stains. George Washington Carver had over 1,000 inventions, only 4 patents. And this was a big debate at Tuskegee Institute at the time about whether these should be patented. And his types of patents plant patents weren't legal until the end of his career. So it's, in a sense, it's not surprising that there were only 4, but he had over 1,000 inventions. Percy Julian, my cousin, who was a big developer of cortisone at Glidden Labs, the first African-American to head a corporate laboratory. And then there's Garrett Morgan, who invented the modern gas mask and the modern traffic light, about whom I've written quite a bit. Here's Garrett Morgan. Here's the traffic light that he invented. And one thing that was interesting about Garrett Morgan, and I'll say more about this later, was that he really bifurcated how he sold his invention. So here he is, he and his family were models for many of the advertisements that had to do with Black hair care. But for the traffic light and for the gas mask, they were not included. And in fact, it was hidden that a Black person was the inventor, because when it was found out that he was the inventor, the orders, say, for his gas mask were canceled by Southern fire departments. So this was a really big deal to stay away, not be evident in the inventions in their advertisement. What I found from looking at patent activity of African Americans is that it is pro-cyclical and consistent with overall patenting before 1900. This is what we would expect. If there is more activity in the economy, there are typically more inventions. But then what I noticed about African Americans, but not for the other patentees, was that it became counter-cyclical and divergent after 1900. So it wasn't moving with economic activity. And this is the key graph in the paper on violence and economic activity. We have white patents in blue and Black patents in red. And again, the appropriate axis for African Americans is the right-hand side, and it's the left-hand side for white inventors. So this is the dramatic change that I mentioned from 1900, this dramatic drop. And then what we see is no recovery. We see some recovery, but no recovery, really. With respect to sectors, they were inventing, there was some overlap with respect to the sectors, the economy they were inventing in. For all patentees, it was mainly manufacturing and agriculture, the least. For African Americans, it was mainly transportation and the least in construction. And this largely reflected where they had opportunities to invent, opportunities to engage. With respect to geographic distribution, they were inventing in largely the same place. Inventors were quite mobile. So all patentees were largely based in the Midwest and the Mid-Atlantic and in New England, and among African Americans, mainly the Midwest and the Mid-Atlantic states. And there's a dramatic drop-off between those two regions and the South. So this is key because during this period, African Americans are still largely concentrated in the South. About 80% of African Americans still lived in the South by the end of this period. So with respect to data, there's a big challenge. So the data weren't available. I was shocked by this, but race is not included on patent data. I couldn't exploit the Black names research that was going on in the early 2000s, say Bertrand Mullin-Nathan or Fryer and Levitt, looking at Black names and later life outcomes. And I tried what they did using census data, and I was able to recover some names, but not very many. Certainly wasn't as useful as it was for them. But in the process of doing so, I came up with the first index of Black names, historical Black names. Later on, my co-authors, John Parman and Trevon Logan, would externally validate those names with their death certificate data, but the first list that was established was mine to try to identify African Americans in the patent data set. Then I started looking for other hypotheses, other ways to try to identify them. There was this popular notion, and I think there still is, that African Americans name themselves after presidents. So I did the sweeping search of African American names using the census again and using Ancestry.com. And what I found was that African Americans named themselves after presidents just like everybody else. This was not uniquely African American. So the inventors who had such names in the data set were George Washington Carver, George Washington Murray, and Andrew Jackson Beard. But the thing that was surprising here, not that both whites and blacks named them, but there was a lot of regional heterogeneity. So you wouldn't find many Abraham Lincoln Smiths in Alabama, for example. You'd find regional heroes, and Abraham Lincoln wasn't considered much of a regional hero in Alabama. So what did I ultimately come up with? Came up with utility patents, which is the most common type of patent. 726 of these patents. These were match data to Black inventors. So I had to try to come up with a universe of Black inventors since these naming patterns weren't working. Since the inventors didn't have Black names, the historical Black names that I identified, and because not many of them named themselves after presidents, I had to come up with something else. So how do I identify the universe of potential African-American inventors? I had a bit of a head start with 1900 surveys that were conducted in 1900 and 1913 by Henry Baker. This was a patent examiner, a supervisor in patent examination. And these were surveys of patent attorneys and patent agents. I looked at every web list available. So just to say one thing about the Baker surveys, they were helpful certainly up to 1913, but they also needed to be revised because Baker actually missed the first African-American patentee in 1821. There were lots of lists of African-American inventors. I scraped the web to find out who these people were and if they had patents. I looked at all sorts of directories of Black scientists, inventors, physicians, and I used popular and other sources for that. I looked at a lot of biographies and academic journals. I went to the National Society of Black Engineers to see if they had more information about engineers during this period. These would largely bias, these sources would largely be biased towards famous people. So I tried to figure out a way that wouldn't just capture famous people. And what I did was, of course, did newspaper searches to see if these inventions or inventors were included. And I looked at obituaries because some of these folks didn't consider themselves, some of these inventors didn't consider themselves inventors. Edison called himself a machinist. A number of the famous Black inventors call themselves machinists in the census records. So they may not have been publicly thought of as so, but often very proud family members would want to discuss this in an obituary. So I did specific newspaper searches and general ones as well. So again, what are the questions to be answered? Does the level or change of innovative or economic activity change in response to changes in violence? That's the first question. If there's an effect, is it uniform across types of violence and types of patents? And is violence really the culprit? That's what I wanted to try to answer. And I had two strategies, one using aggregate time series data and the other using state data to capture regional heterogeneity. So both had Black and white inventors in it, and I'll say a bit about each in just a moment. So what I find is that on average, Black patenting is 0.8% lower per year compared to all patenting. Lynchings have no contemporaneous effect on patenting activity, but they do for Blacks. Riots are contemporaneously and negatively correlated with patent activity. The effects are not homogeneous across technological classes and value classes. So one thing that I found is that segregation laws are negatively correlated with the most valuable patents, electrical and assigned to a firm patents, but this doesn't hold for Southern patents. So how do we rule out other mechanisms and alternate channels? What would Black patenting have been absent hate-related violence? What's the counterfactual? So one exercise that I did was to take the Black parameter estimates from the overall regression and apply them to all inventors, or to the white inventors, the complement of those inventors. And this is what would happen if white inventors ostensibly were subjected to the same violence. So the predicted white patenting appears in red, and the actual white patenting appears in blue. And what you see about this red line is that well, you see two things. It's a lot more volatile, and this would have made business investment, which is now roughly about 20% of GDP. You see that it's much more volatile. This would have made business investment very hard. The other thing that we noticed is that on average, it's a lot lower than actual white patenting. So we see two things from the counterfactual exercise that suggests that GDP would have been a lot lower had everyone been subjected to this kind of violence. I also constructed a placebo to compare white and Black inventors, and the results are largely the same, that this hate-related violence has a significant effect on African Americans. So what is the predicted effect of lynching in places where the Black population is small? So this is an important question because most of the invention is happening outside the South. So the Black population is going to be small in most of these places outside the South. There's also another kind of question embedded here. What does the effect of violence do? How can you prevent this impact on economic activity? So what I find is that the first lynching is the one you want to avoid. And this might be compared to beheadings now, just a shock of such an activity being carried out in your community means that it's the first one that you want to avoid. What we see is that there are diminishing returns to lynching, that after the first lynching, there's not such a large effect. So you want to prevent the first one. And I think that's true for any kind of economic activity, not just, and certainly for society, not just for patents. So the evidence from African American inventors suggests that violence and segregation leading to the abrogation of property rights may influence patenting and economic outcomes. So it's difficult to hide from hate, whether through violence or segregation laws. So when I say difficult to hide from hate, I really mean the Garrett Morgan example of him pretending to be a Native American chief or sending out white actors to sell his gas mask. And the reason he could do that is because his race didn't appear on the patent record. This isn't unique to patents. So I want to suggest to you that this was a much broader phenomenon. So I collected data on newspapers, African-American newspapers at the time, and these are in red in this graph, and Black patents are in blue. And what we see is roughly the same pattern, that there is some recovery after 1900, but not much. And you see this dramatic drop in 1900 as well. So again, I would suggest to you that this isn't just patents. This isn't a particular feature of patents, but a particular feature of economic activity more broadly. There are several extensions that I am working on, and one of them has to do with cleaning up the lynching data. In 2014, I published a paper that showed all of the historical flaws in the lynching data that I used for this paper. And I went about trying to clean up the data to create a national lynching data set. And this suggests to me, after cleaning it up and making it consistent with the NAACP criteria related to lynchings, all of the papers over the last 100 years using lynching data need to be re-estimated. So there's a lot of work to do. There are a lot of extensions. So the new data set goes from 1684 to 1983. And this contains data on lynchings for all races. So one of the biggest flaws was that the data sets divided lynching victims into Black victims and non-Black victims. And over time, those non-Black victims became white victims. And, I was surprised to see a negative coefficient and, fairly large, but not significant on various violence related variables for whites. But when I separated whites from all the other categories, from Asians, Latinos, Native Americans, it was almost zero. So that's what I would have anticipated. So these really did need to be cleaned up. The effect of lynching on patent outcomes in particular was much smaller and still not significant. Another extension is recovering these Black names and externally validating these Black names. And I have two papers with Trevon Logan and John Parman looking at these Black names. And this is something new. This is historical Black names. We think of Black names as only existing in the post-civil rights era, and in this period. But in one paper, we establish these names, we write about the names, and then in another paper, we link these names to mortality outcomes. And what we find is that the Blackest of Black names gets a Black man an extra year of life, which is absolutely unheard of. It's huge. So this is a really interesting line of research that we're following. Trevon Logan and John Parman are working more on segregation. They have a new measure of segregation. And we're also doing work with Trevon Logan and David Rose and other co-authors on the Green Book. So what we're doing is trying to figure out the effect of segregation on establishments and the extent of segregation. So that has been some exciting work to digitize the Green Books. We started this before the movie came out, so we're really trying to investigate this systematically. I have this research agenda called Patents and Ghettos. There are two facts that are still to be explained that I don't explain in this paper. The peak year for patenting per capita for African Americans remains 1899, and this is using 2010 patent data. That's shocking. The median Venner team for African Americans is the size that it was in 1899. It's still one, as opposed to the two at the time when I was writing this, but this has grown much larger since then. And the intuition here is that residential segregation is the culprit. And I have I've done some calculations to suggest that that's the case. I take patents in the Washington, D.C. area, and it turns out that those who are most productive are closest to Whole Foods. And part of me wonders whether this was this is where the networks that are important for invention and innovation actually occur or get started or are nurtured in places like that. So anyway, there's a lot to learn about that. I am looking at Confederate patents. So one observation is that enslaved people had the right to patent under the Confederate States of the US, but not under the US Patent Office, because obviously you couldn't enter into a contract with an enslaved person. But the question here is whether Southerners and enslaved people responded to incentives, the incentive of having their own patent office. Well, it didn't seem like either Southerners or enslaved people responded to this additional protection, having protection from the Southern authorities as opposed to the US authorities, because there was no new Southern invention. All of these were re-registered from the US Patent Office. So it seems like inventors, Southern inventors, wanted to make sure that they were covered, whether the South won or whether the North won. But this invention was not new. And I didn't find any invention that was by an enslaved inventor. So anyway, that is a separate line of research. I work on great inventors and have a couple of papers on those related to social networks. And I think that this is something that I find fascinating, and comparing the social networks of Black great inventors and other great inventors, I find fascinating. But I will stop there. I think this is a really important time in American history, a really important time in the history of Minnesota, of Minneapolis, and thinking about violence and economic activity. And I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Cook. We've already got questions coming in on the Q&A, but I'm going to take advantage of the privilege of moderating to ask you a question right off the bat, and also give you a chance to just kind of relax before we have to take questions, because
Sure,
you've given us so much information. And one of the things that I think we told you is that we have lots of undergraduates out there.
Yes.
And that's wonderful. And one of the things that I've learned from working with undergraduates over the years is they get really excited about wanting to run Stata or get that regression going and all that kind of stuff. So I was wondering if you could, I think you've talked about this a little bit, but if you're going to look at your percentage of time you spent on collecting the data, cleaning the data, and doing all of that versus actually running the regressions in whatever your favorite statistical package is, what would it be?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think it would be either 3-to-1 or 2-to-1. So it's either 60% or 75% of my time is spent collecting data, because to me, it is the question that is important. It is the question, and you've got to be able to collect the data you need to answer the question. So I don't look at data and say, no, other people do this, and say, oh, wow, there's something really odd about these data. Let's try to explain it. I have questions that I want to answer. And let me tell you where this one comes from, the motivation for this paper. So I was writing my dissertation in Russia. I was at the University of California, Berkeley, and I was working on Russian banks and trying to figure out whether a Russian banking system could come into being. So anyway, I was interviewing and was working with a survey organization to interview bankers and entrepreneurs. And, you know, I was asking them all these questions for my dissertation, but they were asking me, why can't innovation come to Russia? So this is in the 1990s, a rough and tumble years of the 1990s. And they were asking me, like, why can't it come here? And, you know, I was thinking, you know, I don't know what to tell you, because, like, I feel threatened every day here, but, you know, that's just me. So anyway, I couldn't answer their question. That's not what I was working on as a graduate student. So finished my dissertation, put that question on the back burner, and kept thinking, so what is it that might be able to answer the question? Is there an historical experiment from anywhere in the world that might be able to give the Russians an answer? So I thought maybe let's look at inventors in the late 19th century US, and let's see what happens. I had no idea, didn't know much about them, knew some of the famous ones, but what I did know is that the intellectual property rights environment didn't change that much, but the physical property rights environment changed a lot. And that had to do with personal security, had to do with the rule of law. So I was really focused on the question, so what does violence do to economic activity? And when I give the seminar, the people who approach me the most from China, from Russia, from Ukraine, they get it. So it's not just related to African Americans. Again, this has much broader implications.
Thank you. I'm going to, even though I have tons more, I would love to ask. We have lots of other people, so I'm going to ask their questions for them.
Okay.
So first of all, and I apologize in advance for people's names who I mispronounce, from Cindy Hauser. She's asking, why do men with Black names have an extra year of life? Why, do you have a hypothesis about that, about what's going on?
I do, and I think this is still the leading one in our research team. I think that there was a culture that surrounded, especially the Old Testament. So most of these names were Old Testament biblical names, and there were Black schools that were located in Black churches. So everybody had this understanding of what these names meant and the story surrounding these names. So, you know, if a person named Moses was sitting in the front of a chemistry class and falling asleep, you know, you can imagine the teacher saying, you know, how can you lead our people out of poverty, out of discrimination when you're falling asleep in class every day, right? So it might be that there were expectations put on these individuals throughout their lives. So it may not have been just educational outcomes that were different and life outcomes that were different, but it could have been the whole range of outcomes. So I think that for me is the most compelling argument.
That actually leads to another question from Isabel Pasteur. Do you think that formerly enslaved people's children and grandchildren having access to education and of course emancipation could have something to do with the 1899 1900 peak for patents, that they benefited from the air? I'm adding to her question here, but you know,
Right.
the benefits
Right.
of Reconstruction, and then they actually got that not to use the term, but treatment effects might be
right. No, I see what you mean. That's a good question. For the period 1870 to say the mid 1880s, what I found that these were largely inventions that related to occupations during slavery. So trays and brooms and other things that they might have used to improve their productivity, right? To lessen the effort they had to put forward. In the 1880s, this kind of shifted to the transportation that I talked about before, transportation, manufacturing, and so on. So I don't think it was the children necessarily. I think, okay, so it was the children afterwards, but a number of them, including Elijah McCoy, a number of the families had fled the US and were living in Canada. Garrett Morgan went to engineering school in Scotland from Canada and then came back to the US and settled because, you know, inventors are mobile. He settled in Ypsilanti, Michigan, which is right outside of Detroit. You know, this corridor between Cleveland and Detroit was really the Silicon Valley of that time. So I think that slavery had something to do with it, but I think that these were the children of slaves, but I don't think that of enslaved people, but I don't think that they were patenting, say, their parents' inventions. But certainly they had opportunities during Reconstruction that others that others didn't before Reconstruction and after Reconstruction.
This is a question from Marty Walsh. Early on, you mentioned public transit segregation laws. Is there a connection between those laws, the reduction in availability of public transit in the 20th century, and reduced economic activity in Black communities that generally seem to be more reliant on mass transit? It's a little out of the, but it's an interesting connection.
No, it is an interesting connection. I think that analysis and that scenario would be more applicable to the period after the one I'm talking about, because mass transit systems were, they were available, but let's say there wasn't the kind of reliance, say, that you saw during Montgomery bus boycott, right? You
Okay.
didn't
Yep.
have so much there, but these laws were cumulative. So the public institution I think was probably most relevant was the library, because this is where inventors ran into each other. They checked the patent digest. So I think this is really the Plessy versus Ferguson effect, just segregating everything. So let's say you ran into another inventor while going to see your patent agent or your patent attorney. There was a free flow of information. And all of a sudden, African Americans couldn't go to the commercial district where the patent attorney would have been. And there weren't African American patent attorneys until the 1970s. So this was just completely shutting them out.
Wow. Oh, I'm so tempted to ask you more stuff of my own, but I won't. From my fellow panelist and former president, Stacey Bosley, the change at 1900 is so large. Could you speak a bit more about why that would have been so dramatic in 1900? And in particular, could you address hypotheses about the lack of recovery even after the civil rights era?
I think, again, that this is Plessy versus Ferguson. So I learned from my constitutional law scholar friends that 2 or 3 years after a Supreme Court ruling is when you have rulemaking and when these laws actually come into effect. So states figure out what they can do, and they do it. So it takes 2 or 3 years for that to happen. So this puts us right at 1899, 1900, right? So this is year of application. This is year of application. So I think that is one of the leading explanations for what happened during that period. That's why I think it would apply to newspapers and other types of economic activity. For the current period, I think that the rise in residential segregation that Plessy versus Ferguson allowed, promoted, let be, I think that this contributes to what we see now. If my patents and ghettos project is correct, and we still have median inventor team of 1, that's a 100-year effect. So I think that's what's going on there, that you really need so many networks, financial, invention, and scientific networks to get research done, to get invention done, to get innovation done, that residential segregation, which determines where you go to school, where you shop, everything else, determines what your networks are largely now. I think that is the essence of what's going on now.
I'll just give a shout out to a wonderful project at the University of Minnesota called the Mapping Prejudice Project, which looks at housing covenants and how that really broke up the African American communities in Minneapolis, especially. So those networks. From an anonymous attendee, it is really interesting that the first act of violence had the greatest effect of deterrence. What's the decomposition of the effect you observe, and how much of the effect is it on patents that are never filed versus patents that perhaps are delayed?
So I wouldn't be able to answer that question. I think that I haven't looked at that, but I think we might be able to study that, the second question. But the first question about deterrence, I think it's just a shock of a lynching, that this is the ultimate abrogation of the rule of law, suggests that it would have this effect, that it would have the greatest effect, and that the second one would have a diminished effect. So I think that that's how acts of violence work. I mean, I think that when we saw beheadings in Syria and Iraq and other places, I think we were definitely shocked. This isn't something that is typical for Americans to see. So I think the first one, I think, you know, there are names that we remember, like Daniel Pearl. You know, there's one that we remember, and certainly there are many others that happened since that time. But the first one is the one that shocked us, and I think, and it may not have been the real first one, the first one that many of us knew about. So so I think that that's how this works, how that mechanism works. But that suggests that prevention of extreme violence is what we want to engage in. And I think that's how this research relates to the present.
Thank you. From Joshua Snap, he has a question that's more related actually to some things you brought up earlier. He writes, you have so much international experience as an economist, and an exclamation point there. So, you know, it's a very cool thing he wants to emphasize. What would you suggest as a good way to get involved in, he says, the international community? And I would add, you know, like in doing work in the international sphere.
Good question. I did Model UN. That's one way to do it. I studied abroad for a year, and I studied at the University of Strasbourg through a program with Syracuse University as an undergraduate. I studied at the University of Dakar for a year, and certainly was a Marshall Scholar at Oxford for 2 years. So I ran into all kinds of people, and I always got on the cheapest form of transportation, had student passes, you know, stayed in nunneries with, you know, with stranded travelers and hostels all over the world. So I had some really incredible conversations at that time. Debated an Israeli soldier, a person who just gotten out of the Israeli army for 22 hours straight. So, you know, I think that sometimes when our understanding of any subject is sort of asymmetric, and it becomes unidimensional. When I say asymmetric, it comes from our professors and we sort of understand it in that way. It comes to life, and it comes to 3D when you have to live it. And you're not in the majority anymore. You're the American who may not be accepted everywhere, for example. I wound up defending that 22-hour debate was about US foreign policy. And the Israeli soldier I was debating declared that I was the winner. And he was like, you're not like most Americans. I was like, you haven't met many Americans if you think that I'm a good debater. There are other people who actually know about the policy who would defend it. So anyway, that was one way that I got involved. But I think studying abroad in terms of actually learning a language, in terms of seeing things through other people's eyes, I think that was absolutely important.
Get out there.
Right.
Katarina Hansen has a question. Are there any possible explanations for the peaks in patent activity, or are they more random?
The peaks seem to be consistent in the overall data set and in the Black data set before 1900. They seem to be consistent with overall economic activity. So that's what we typically see. There are two things that patents are consistent with. One is war. So there's a lot more invention and redirection of invention during wartime. Now, you don't see this after World War I because those patents become not ones that we have access to. So they become secret patents, the ones related to defense or have military applications. But for the most part, it's pro-cyclical and follows wartime. But that would explain the peaks for the most part.
A question from an anonymous attendee. How do these findings apply to the violence in the Black let me start again. How do these findings apply to the violence the Black community experiences today? Do you expect similar effects?
I would expect similar effects in the Black community, but I would also expect similar effects on the white community. Again, this didn't, these are patents. These are the basis of innovation and economic growth. I also expect it for countries. So, we're talking about, like I said, the people who are typically most engaged when I give this talk are people from Russia, from China, from Ukraine. So they can see the applications on a much larger scale, not just within the Black community. So I would say that, of course, it is immediately related to the Black community, as is the death of George Floyd. But I would say it has implications much beyond that.
I'm just going to add a question of my own that follows up on that. So I'm actually teaching a course on economic growth starting on Monday. And one of the things that scholars have identified is a slowdown in the long run rate of growth since around 2000. Do you think perhaps that this is one of the things that is slowing down American economic growth, that we are, in a sense, not taking advantage as a society of those who could be innovating and creating new technologies? And I'm babbling a bit, but I'm thinking of it off the top of my head.
Absolutely. Keep going. You're actually speaking my current research. I have a whole research agenda that I didn't mention on that, called the idea gap in pink and Black. And what I calculate with my colleague is that we would have GDP per capita that is 0.6% to 4.4% higher if we engaged more African Americans and more women in every stage of the innovative process. So in education and STEM education, not exclusively STEM, but especially STEM education, in the practice of invention, and in commercialization of invention. So we're leaving money on the table. Absolutely. Absolutely.
I need your paper for my class.
Oh yeah, I'll send you a link. Absolutely.
President Mattson, that's the end of the questions. I have one more, I guess. I'll say it, and then I want to turn it over to you. So from Spencer Carvinen, could you just say a little bit more about how you calculate that extra GDP growth from having more women and more just more innovation from outside the usual sources, the usual suspects?
Right. That's a good question. So I answer it in two ways. The first way is that what we know from recent papers like Shea, Jones, Clennell, and Hurst is that the underplacement of highly skilled people 50 years ago has led to a 20 to 40% decline in aggregate productivity, or we lost 20 to 40% of aggregate productivity and output as a result of that underplacement of talent. So that has to do with segregation. That's just African Americans. That's, putting physicians, Black physicians, in lower occupations, not taking advantage of their talent. Cost us 20 to 40% in GDP. So that's one answer to your question. Another answer is that this was methodology that Jennifer Hunt and her co-authors developed for women, and we just added African Americans, and the range goes from 0.6% if we just assumed African American PhDs, an increase in African American PhDs, and the upper end of the range includes BAs and PhDs for African Americans and women. So there's a well and accepted transition from these STEM degrees to patents, to the patent stock.
Wow, I can't wait to see this. So another question from Katarina Hansen. Do you think there could ever be a full recovery for the lost economic activity from 1900? And if so, what policies should we be advocating for the people and for and by the people and their representatives?
That's a good question. I think that there are two answers to the question, and I'm not sure this will be satisfactory, but let's stop the misallocation now, right? Let's stop and how do we do that? So we do that by diminishing workplace climate, by making places where invention happens friendlier to underrepresented minorities, Latinos, African Americans, and to women. That means, for example, making childcare more available during work times, or not penalizing women for having small children or having to take care of others in the household, so the elderly and so on. We know this from the American Time Use Survey that they spend a disproportionate time on care of other people in the home. So we can make workplaces, and we've seen that having more women on boards leads to better outcomes. There's a law in California fashioned on laws in the EU related to having at least one woman on a board, and this is having a real effect. So I'm saying that we can do things. We can hold managers accountable. We can hold CEOs accountable at every level for leaving money on the table. One result, I'll just quickly, I know we're going over, one result that I found most striking in my research from the very beginning was that patent teams that were single-sex male or single-sex female were less productive than those that were mixed gender. So CEOs are leaving money on the table. Universities are leaving money on the table. So you can keep, so that is of grave concern, or should be of grave concern to shareholders, because what they're expecting is that the CEO, that supervisors up and down the management chain are the best stewards of the resources of the firm or of the university, of the organization. Well, clearly they're not.
So big picture effects. Big picture effects.
Absolutely, absolutely. And if we're going to anticipate 2% anemic growth as we would for any industrialized country going forward, given what you've learned about 2000 and going forward, this is where we're going to get extra innovation, how we're going to get extra growth, extra increases in living standards. So this is the dimension along which we actually have to work.
Well, we're not going over time. It's just we want to be careful with your time. I just thought I'd put out one more call. There's lots of students, and if you have any questions, I just want to give you one more opportunity. Dr. Cook is here. It's not often you get an opportunity to speak with a scholar like this. So just want to give you a chance if you want to type a question in. Just see.
Well, I'm happy to follow up on questions. I actually do have to. I did have to go to a meeting now, but I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to the students and to speak to everyone, and I appreciate your questions. But if there are follow-up questions, please feel free to forward them to me. I'd be happy to answer them.
I can gather them up and send them along.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Cook. Virtual round of applause.
Yes.
The pleasure's all mine. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. Thanks.
All right. Bye-bye. Have a great rest of the academic year.
You too.
For the rest of us who are staying out there, we're going to switch gears to recognizing the winners of our annual MEA undergraduate student paper contest. So let me share my slides with you here. I
was just going to say, while you're doing that, I will put the people who are our winners as panelists. So if you get a note from me, you will now be on the screen.
Perfect. So we do have a few panelists, a few winners with us today. Lewis will elevate you to panelist status, so be prepared. And as he's doing that, I will say all of our paper contest winners are located on the MEA's webpage, which is minneapolisfed.org/MEA/student-paper-contest. You can go there and get this year's winners as well as previous year's winners. We have 3 categories to our annual student paper contest: senior thesis, which is an original research paper written as the culmination of a student's senior year; term paper, which is an original research paper written as part of a course or the culmination of a term. And then a newer category in the last few years is economic communication. And it's a little distinct from the other 2 categories in that it is not original written research. It could take a variety of forms: a written blog, a podcast, an electronic poster, a video, a description of someone else's research, or a policy paper based on the research of someone else. We are going to start this morning by recognizing the winners of our senior thesis competition. In 3rd place, The Political Economy of State-Level Social Cost of Carbon Policy by Will Machiel from U of M Twin Cities and his advisor Pamela Smith. Will was not able to be with us this morning, so we don't have him, but congratulations to Will. In 2nd place in the senior thesis competition, The Effects of the Minimum Wage on Social Safety Net Dependence Over Time, Camille Baker from Macalester College and her advisor Sarah West, also unable to be with us today. But in 1st place in the senior thesis competition, Do Biometric Smart Cards Help the Neediest Most? Evidence from a large-scale field study in Andhra Pradesh. Noam Benkler from Carleton College, advisor Ferris Bouyan, and I believe Noam is with us this morning. Hello, Noam. Could you tell us a little bit about your paper?
Hi, sure. So to briefly summarize, one of the largest challenges welfare programs in developing countries face is leakage, or the process by which corrupt officials pocket funds before they reach intended beneficiaries. My thesis, Do Biometric Smart Cards Help the Neediest Most?, evaluates the impact of a biometrically authenticated smart card system on this leakage from employment and pensions programs in the state of Andhra Pradesh, India. For a sense of scale, the employment program, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, is the largest working welfare program in the world and covers about 11% of the world's total population. So analyzing data from just over 97,000 individuals, my research confirmed at the individual level, prior findings at the household level, that smart cards did significantly reduce leakage in both programs. Moreover, I found evidence that smart cards helped reduce discrimination and leakage targeting based on caste, actively benefiting members of scheduled castes, also known as Dalit, who have a long history of discrimination and violence against them in India, more highly than they benefited members of other castes. Interestingly, my evidence also suggested that more geographically isolated tribes are actively hurt by the smart cards program, possibly because incomplete program implementation simply displaces corruption onto minorities with less access to smart cards. These results essentially indicated that smart cards can improve welfare program efficacy in developing countries, but will only properly address discrimination when governments ensure universal access to smart cards. Is that good?
Excellent. Thank you so much. We will move on to our term paper category. In 3rd place, The Effect of Unemployment on the Decision to Enter the Illegal Ivory Trade by Elizabeth Kula of St. Catherine University. Her advisor is Christine West, and Libby is with us today. Libby, you want to say a few words about your paper?
Yeah, thank you. So my paper used a district level fixed effects regression to look at how the unemployment rate within an African district affected the rate of African elephants that were poached in a given year. So this was really the first study to look at this question kind of across different contexts in the African continent. Previous studies had both been kind of localized to the Kenyan context. So this paper kind of provides the first evidence of this economic effects, local economic effects on the decision to enter the illegal ivory trade, kind of more generally. But yeah, thank you so much. And I just want to thank my advisor, Dr. Christine West, and the rest of the community at St. Catherine University. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Libby. In 2nd place in our term paper competition, The Effects of Access to Clean Water and Sanitation on Household Healthcare Expenditure, Evidence from the Philippines by Tianrui Liu of Macalester College and her advisor, Amy Damon, and she is with us today too.
Hello. So to briefly summarize my research, lack of access to clean water and sanitation has been a worldwide problem for decades. It can lead to pervasive health risks in developing countries, and research has shown that it's associated with several diseases such as the
I want to
cholera
cry. I did not really prepare for this.
and diarrhea. So as health risks increase, OOP healthcare expenditure dramatically rise. And the incentive of this research is focusing on the idea that a large portion of the healthcare spending from people with lower socioeconomic status are probably induced by disease that can be prevented by available access to safe water. So I used the data set from the Philippines National Demographic and Health Survey acquired by the DHS program for this research. And I used the Grossman model in health economics to support my thesis. The empirical results actually verify with the predictions of the economic theories. As the primary regression suggests, when access to clean water and sanitation is deficient, household expenditure on health increases by an average of 5,600 pesos in combined, which is 26% of the average monthly house family income in the Philippines.
Great, thank you. And in first place in the term paper category, Natural Disasters and FDI, Evidence from India by Aidan Toner Rogers of McAllister and advisor Amy Damon. Aidan is not able to be with us today. We'll move on to the economic communication category. In third place, the one-child policy and reproductive justice, son preference, sex selection, violence, and demography by Isabel Pasteur at St. Catherine University. And her advisor is Christine West. I believe, Isabel, you are with us today.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you for this recognition, and thank you for getting Dr. Cook to speak at this event. She's wonderful, so thank you so much. This is a policy paper I wrote about the one-child policy, and this policy was enacted in China to control a growing population amid fears of Malthusian-style resource shortage and population collapse. And it was in direct violation of reproductive rights because women did not have control over how many children to have, when to have them, and under what conditions. Rich women were able to get around the one-child policy by paying fines and bribes, while poor women's reproduction was much more strictly controlled. Women who did not comply with the one-child policy and could not afford to pay the fines were forced to have abortions and were intimidated with violence. The one-child policy also exacerbated pre-existing son preference. Chinese preferred to have sons for cultural reasons, like patrilineal family structures, and because of the low economic returns to having a daughter. With just one shot at having a son, millions of Chinese women had sex-selective abortions to ensure that they would have a son. So essentially, the policy created kind of a hot mess of patriarchy where this pre-existing sexism incentivized further sexism and reproductive control. The one-child policy was ended in 2015, but the violence and stripping of reproductive rights have traumatized generations of Chinese, some of whom missed their only opportunity to have children. The widespread sex selection has created a skewed sex ratio, and there are about 30 million women missing from China's population now. China's population also declined too much, too quickly, and there are now urban labor shortages, which is kind of shocking for a country with such a large population. The dependency burden is also extremely high, especially considering that there is not a social security system to support the elderly in China. So all in all, the one-child policy was disastrous and harmful to women and set back gender equality and reproductive justice. So this should teach us that when it comes to policies to support reproductive rights and reproductive justice, there's a lot more to it than just the right to have an abortion. It's about the right to have an abortion and to have a child and to safely parent your children. China has combated sex selection by banning fetal sex determination during pregnancy, but they also need to create a social safety net for the elderly and combat economic gender inequality. And the bottom line is that reproductive justice is an economic issue. Again, thank you so much. And this is the most important election of our lives. So please go out and vote. If you have not voted, go to iwillvote.com and make your voting plan.
Thank you. In second place in our economic communication category, state characteristics and carbon emissions, Brianna Burninghouse, Lindsay Hawk, and Devin Stolsatz from Hamlin University and their advisor, Stacey Bosley. They are not able to be with us today. This entry and the first place winner are poster entries, and you can take a look at those posters on the MEA's website. The first place entry, MLB Team Success, Offense versus Defense by Andrew Argyros, Ryan Brower, and Jake Dubinvik from Hamlin University, and their advisor, Stacey Bosley. So congratulations to all of our paper competition winners. We will host the competition again next year as we always do, and we hope that you'll participate. And before we end the conference for today, I'm going to turn it over for one last moment to Lewis Johnston, our incoming MEA president.
Well, thank you. And as my first act, I guess, as president, I hope that you will all join us again next year. Thank you so much for joining us this year. Thank you, Carmi, for your yeoman service as president. It has been a pleasure and an honor to serve with you. And Stacy, the same. You're the outgoing president now. So thank you for everything that you've done. So I look forward to seeing all of you next year. Tell your friends, tell your fellow students, and I declare this meeting adjourned.